The courtroom was unusually still that morning. The shuffle of papers, the hum of the air conditioner, even the faint coughs from the back benches, everything seemed to echo louder than usual. Judge Frank Caprio sat behind his desk, calm and composed as always, his glasses low on his nose as he glanced over the next case file. "Maria Santos," the clerk announced. A young woman rose nervously, clutching her purse like it was the only thing keeping her steady. Beside her, a small boy stood, barely reaching her waist, his shirt neatly tucked in, his eyes wide but determined. He couldn't have been older than 7. Caprio looked up, a soft smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Good morning, ma'am," he said kindly. "And who's this young man?" The mother hesitated. "This is my son Daniel. He wanted to come with me." Before she could say more, the boy took a small step forward and spoke in a clear, almost practiced voice. "Your Honor," he said, "I want to talk for my mom." The room froze. Even the officer standing by the door looked up in surprise. A few people in the back chuckled, assuming it was a child's boldness. But the judge didn't laugh. He leaned back, curious. "You want to talk for your mom?" Caprio asked. Daniel nodded. "Yes, sir." Caprio glanced at Maria, who looked both embarrassed and proud. "All right," the judge said gently. "Go ahead, young man. Tell me what you want to say." And then silence. The kind of silence that feels alive. Daniel's little hands tightened into fists. When he finally spoke, his voice trembled at first, but his words carried weight far beyond his years. "She didn't mean to go too fast," he said softly. "She just didn't want to be late again. She works every night and she still makes me breakfast before school. She never sleeps much. I told her I could stay home alone, but she said no because—" He paused. The judge leaned in. The officers did too. "Because she says I'm the best thing Daddy left her." No one moved. No one spoke. Even Caprio, a man who had heard thousands of stories, felt something shift inside the room, a presence heavier than law itself. For the first time that morning, the judge didn't have a question ready. He simply whispered, "Go on, son." The boy looked up at him, his eyes glassy but fearless. "I just don't want her to get in trouble for trying to be a good mom." And with those words, the courtroom forgot to breathe. Outside the courthouse that morning, the sky was still gray, the kind of gray that hides the sun but never quite rains. Maria had woken before dawn as she always did. She made breakfast for Daniel, though most mornings she barely ate herself. Her hands shook slightly as she tied his shoelaces, pretending not to feel the exhaustion burning behind her eyes. Maria Santos had once dreamed of becoming a nurse practitioner. But after her husband, Miguel, passed away in a factory accident 3 years earlier, life became about survival, not dreams. The bills piled up, the rent doubled, and the nursing home where she worked cut hours just when she needed them most. She picked up every extra shift she could find, nights, weekends, even double shifts. And yet, no matter how tired she was, she never let Daniel see her break. When he asked about his dad, she smiled and told him that angels don't really leave, they just learn to watch from higher windows. That morning, as they walked up the courthouse steps, Daniel squeezed her hand. "Don't worry, Mama," he whispered. "I'll tell the judge the truth. You didn't do anything bad." Maria smiled faintly, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. "You just sit beside me and be my brave boy, okay?" But Daniel shook his head. "I'm not sitting this time. I'm helping." She wanted to protest, but something in his eyes, that stubborn mix of innocence and courage, silenced her. Inside, Judge Caprio was known for his patience and humanity. He treated every person who stood before him not as a number or a case, but as a story. When Maria's turn came, he offered the same warm tone he gave everyone. "Miss Santos," he said, "you're here for a speeding violation, 35 in a 20 zone, correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," she said softly, her voice cracking. The judge smiled kindly. "We all make mistakes. Don't worry, we'll figure this out." But before she could explain, Daniel tugged at her sleeve and whispered, "Can I talk now, Mama?" Caprio heard him. "Talk? You have something to say, young man?" Daniel nodded earnestly. "Yes, sir. Because Mama didn't mean to. She just didn't want to lose her job. And if she loses her job, we lose our house." The courtroom fell quiet. Maria's head dropped. Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, not from shame but from the heartbreak of being seen too clearly. Caprio's expression softened. He'd seen grown men break down in that courtroom, but never a child standing up for love. In that moment he had no idea that this tiny boy, with a trembling voice and big brown eyes, was about to teach everyone in the room what justice really meant. Judge Caprio leaned forward, elbows resting on the bench, his eyes fixed on Daniel. "All right, young man," he said, his tone half serious, half intrigued. "If you're going to speak for your mother, I need to hear your best argument. Why shouldn't she have to pay for this ticket?" The courtroom chuckled softly, not mocking, just charmed by the audacity of a 7-year-old taking on a judge. But Daniel didn't smile. His little hands were clasped in front of him, and when he spoke, his voice was steady. "It wasn't Mama's fault," he said firmly. "She was just tired. Not bad tired, the kind when you work too much. She works all night taking care of old people who don't have anyone else. Sometimes she sleeps only when I'm at school." The room quieted again. Maria looked at her son, her eyes wide, her lips trembling. Daniel went on. "She always makes my breakfast, even when her eyes are red and her hands hurt. She says I need to eat so I can be strong. But sometimes she just drinks coffee and says she's not hungry. I know she's lying." Caprio blinked slowly. "You're very observant for your age," he said. Daniel nodded, not quite understanding the compliment. "Mama says I have to notice things. She says people forget to see how hard someone's trying until it's too late." A murmur ran through the courtroom. It wasn't just what the boy said, it was how he said it. There was no rehearsed tone, no adult prompting. Just raw truth, spoken from a child's heart that had already seen too much. The judge cleared his throat. "Your mother was driving 35 in a 20-mile zone. That's fast. Why do you think that happened?" Daniel took a breath, glancing up at his mom. "Because she was scared," he said simply. "She was late again. And the man at her job said if she's late one more time she can't come back. So she was hurrying. She always hurries. Not because she wants to, but because everything costs money." Someone in the back sighed quietly. Caprio glanced toward the gallery. Even the officers were listening now, their faces softened. Daniel added, "Sometimes when Mama gets home she falls asleep sitting up. I cover her with my blanket. I don't want her to lose her job. She works too hard to be in trouble." The judge's hand rested over his chin, his voice gentler now. "And you, Daniel, why did you want to come today?" The boy hesitated, then whispered, "Because I wanted to tell you she's a good person. She helps everyone. She helps me. She doesn't deserve to be in trouble just because we're poor." The silence that followed wasn't ordinary, it was sacred. Even Caprio's gavel seemed out of place in that moment. He sat back slowly, realizing that this wasn't just a case anymore. It was a mirror, and a 7-year-old boy was holding it up for the whole world to see. Judge Caprio leaned back in his chair, studying the boy carefully. The gentle curiosity in his eyes had shifted into something deeper, a quiet ache, a recognition. He had seen countless people stand before him, all pleading, all explaining. But this was different. The truth wasn't coming from desperation. It was coming from love. "Daniel," the judge said softly, "I appreciate your honesty. You're very brave for standing up for your mom. But speeding can be dangerous, don't you think? What if someone got hurt?" The boy nodded. "Yes, sir. That's what Mama always says too. But that day she wasn't thinking about danger. She was thinking about me." Caprio tilted his head slightly. "About you?" Daniel's lips trembled. His voice came out quieter now, each word weighted with memory. "I fainted at school," he said. "I didn't eat breakfast that morning, because I wanted to save the milk for later. Mama didn't know. When the teacher called her, she ran out of work to come get me. She said the hospital was on the other side of the city, and she was scared. That's why she was driving fast." You could hear the air shift in the room, that sudden stillness that happens when truth enters a place too small to hold it. The officer by the door lowered his gaze. A woman in the audience pressed a tissue to her eyes. Maria sat frozen beside her son, one hand covering her mouth. "Daniel," she whispered, tears spilling over. "Stop, baby, it's okay." But Daniel shook his head. "No, Mama. You said we have to tell the truth even when it's hard." He looked back at the judge, small shoulders squared, eyes glistening with the courage only a child could carry. "She didn't mean to break the law. She just wanted to get to me. She was crying on the phone and I told her I was okay, but I wasn't. I was scared. And I didn't want her to lose her job for helping me." Caprio's lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. He glanced down at the papers in front of him, meaningless now, just ink and numbers that couldn't measure this moment. Daniel took another small breath, steadying himself. "I just don't want Mama to be in trouble for loving me." The words hung there, simple, fragile, and enormous. For several seconds no one moved. Not the judge, not the clerk, not even the cameras that captured every case. It felt as though the whole courtroom had forgotten it was a courtroom. It had become something else, a sanctuary for truth. Caprio slowly removed his glasses and set them on the bench. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quieter than anyone had ever heard it. "Daniel," he said, "you've reminded us all of something very important today. The law is supposed to protect people, not punish love." He glanced at Maria, who was now quietly sobbing, her face buried in her hands. "Miss Santos," he said softly, "you raised quite a remarkable young man." Daniel looked confused. "Does that mean we're in trouble?" Caprio smiled faintly, his voice breaking just a little. "No, son," he said. "It means you've already won something far greater than any case." The courtroom remained silent, not out of respect for the law, but for the love that had just rewritten it. And as Daniel climbed back into his mother's arms, the judge looked down at his papers one last time and whispered to himself, words the microphone barely caught. "This little boy just gave me the most honest testimony I've ever heard." For a long time Judge Caprio didn't speak. He simply looked down at his notes, pretending to read what he already knew didn't matter anymore. The courtroom waited, breaths held, hearts still. Daniel sat beside his mother again, his small hand gripping hers tightly, as if bracing for whatever came next. Finally, Caprio leaned forward, his voice calm but filled with emotion. "You know," he began, "I've been on this bench a long time. I've seen people come in angry, defensive, or scared. But every once in a while, someone reminds me what this courtroom is really about, and today that someone is you, Daniel." The boy's eyes widened. "Me?" "Yes," Caprio said, nodding slowly. "You see, my job isn't just to make people pay fines or follow rules. It's to understand the story behind those rules. And your story, your mother's story, reminded me why justice needs a heart." The audience stirred softly, moved by the gentleness in his tone. Maria looked up, tears shining on her cheeks. "Your Honor," she said quietly, "I never wanted him to say all that. I just couldn't leave him alone at home. I didn't mean to break the law." Caprio raised a hand gently. "You don't need to explain any more, Miss Santos. Your son already did that better than any lawyer ever could." He turned to Daniel again, smiling. "You know, young man, you make a very convincing argument. I think maybe one day you'll be the one sitting in this chair." Daniel blinked, unsure how to respond. "You mean I could be a judge?" Caprio chuckled. "If you keep that heart of yours, you already are one." The laughter in the courtroom was light and genuine, the kind that heals after too much silence. Then the judge picked up the file, glanced at it once more and closed it with a soft thud. "Here's what we're going to do," he said, his tone turning official again but with a warmth that filled the room. "The court will dismiss this case entirely. Miss Santos, you owe nothing. No fine, no penalty." Maria gasped, her hands covering her mouth. "Thank you, Your Honor," she whispered. But Caprio wasn't finished. "However," he added, "I am going to give you both one special assignment." Daniel tilted his head. "Assignment?" The judge nodded. "Yes. Since you saved your mother from paying this fine, you now have the job of making sure she takes that money and spends it on something important." "Like what?" Daniel asked. Caprio leaned closer, smiling. "Dinner. A good one. Just the two of you. No rushing, no worry. That's an order from the court." The entire courtroom erupted in laughter and applause. Even the officer clapped quietly against his leg. Maria wiped her eyes, shaking her head with disbelief and gratitude. And as they turned to leave, Daniel looked back at the judge, grinning shyly. "Thank you, Your Honor." Caprio smiled, his eyes misting over. "No, Daniel," he said softly. "Thank you for reminding us all what mercy looks like when the law listens." The courtroom emptied slowly that morning, but the silence lingered long after the doors closed. People wiped their eyes discreetly, pretending it was just dust in the air. Even the officers stood a little taller, as if reminded that compassion was part of their uniform too. Judge Caprio sat for a moment, alone at the bench, staring at the closed file on his desk. He had handled thousands of cases, some painful, some humorous, some tragic, but few ever stayed with him like this one would. In his long career he had seen the law bend and break, but never had he seen it melt like it did when a child defended love. Later that week, a recording of the moment surfaced online. Within hours, it spread across social media. Millions of people watching a 7-year-old boy teaching the world a lesson no textbook could ever hold. Comment sections filled with tears, prayers, and memories of mothers who sacrificed everything. Strangers wrote, "That boy said what we all feel but never say out loud." Reporters asked Judge Caprio how it felt to be silenced in his own courtroom. He smiled and said quietly, "It wasn't silence. It was respect. Sometimes when truth speaks that pure, all you can do is listen. Maria and Daniel became local heroes. Donations poured in, letters arrived from around the country, and one message stood out above all. You reminded us that being poor doesn't mean being guilty. But the real legacy of that day wasn't in headlines or interviews, it lived in the way people started looking at each other differently. For a brief moment, kindness became contagious again. And so, friends, as we close this story, take a breath and remember, sometimes the smallest voices carry the biggest truths. Ask yourself, how many times have you stayed silent when compassion could have spoken louder? How many Daniels in this world go unheard because we're too busy judging before we listen? If this story touched your heart, share it. Let someone else feel what you just felt. Because the world doesn't need more punishment, it needs understanding. As Judge Caprio once said, mercy is not weakness, it's strength with a heartbeat. And before we fade to black, a whisper of curiosity, because not every story ends here. In another courtroom on another morning, a young girl will stand up to defend her father. That's where our next story begins, the girl who defended her father in court.